His presence irritates me. I wish he'd just disappear forever. She said it like it was nothing, like commenting on the weather or the music playing too loud in the background. And the worst part wasn't the words. It was the way the room reacted, the soft laughter, the subtle nods, the way people avoided looking directly at me like I had already faded out of existence. Like I was something uncomfortable they didn't want to acknowledge. And I stood there holding a glass of bourbon I hadn't touched, the ice already melted into something weak and watered down, thinking how strange it was that a man could spend years building a life, paying the mortgage, fixing the sink at 2 a.m., remembering birthdays, showing up every single day, and still end up feeling like a ghost in his own home, in his own marriage, in his own life. And I didn't say anything, not because I didn't have something to say, but because in that moment I realized something far worse than anger, something quieter, something colder, something that settled into my chest like a truth I had been avoiding for years. I realized she wasn't wrong, not entirely, not in the way that mattered, because you don't suddenly become invisible overnight. It happens slowly, in small moments that don't seem important at first, conversations where your voice gets talked over, decisions made without you, laughter that doesn't include you, and I could trace it back if I wanted to. Back to the first time she checked her phone instead of listening, the first time she introduced me as just Ethan, the first time I felt like an extra in a life I thought we were building together. But standing there under those warm yellow lights with the hum of polite conversation filling the space, none of that mattered anymore, because the truth had already landed, clean and sharp, and it didn't come with shouting or tears or drama. It came with silence, the kind that makes everything else feel distant, like you're watching your own life from across the room. And I remember setting the glass down, carefully on the table, making sure it didn't make a sound, adjusting my jacket like it was just another normal moment in a normal night. And no one stopped me, no one asked where I was going, not even her, because why would they? You don't notice when something disappears if you've already decided it wasn't there to begin with. And as I walked out into the cool night air, the city stretching out in front of me with its quiet hum and distant headlights moving like slow rivers of light, I took a breath that felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, like something had finally snapped into place. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I didn't feel the need to stay. I didn't feel the need to be seen, because the truth was simple. If my presence irritated her, if my existence felt like a burden, then maybe the most honest thing I could do, the cleanest thing I could do, was exactly what she asked for. And that night, without a word, without a scene, without leaving anything behind but a quiet space where I used to stand, I disappeared. I did not go home that night, and that was the first decision that felt entirely mine in years. Not reactive, not emotional, just deliberate, like placing a piece on a board after finally understanding the game. And I drove without music, without a destination, letting the highway stretch out in front of me under the cold glow of streetlights. Mile after mile of empty asphalt and quiet, the kind of quiet that does not press on you but instead gives you space to think. And for the first time in a long time, my thoughts were not loud. They were not chaotic. They were steady, almost clinical, like I was observing my own life from a distance, reviewing it the way an outsider would. And what I saw was not a sudden collapse but a long pattern, years of small compromises that slowly erased me, moments where I chose peace over presence, silence over truth, until eventually there was nothing left to defend. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, I pulled into a gas station off Interstate 35. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of coffee and motor oil hanging in the air, and I stood there for a second longer than necessary, looking at my reflection in the dark window of the convenience store, trying to recognize the man staring back at me. And what struck me was not that he looked broken, it was that he looked unfinished, like a version of himself that had stopped evolving years ago. And that realization did not hurt, it clarified things, because if something is unfinished, it means it can still be rebuilt. And I grabbed a cheap cup of black coffee, paid in cash, and walked back out into the night without checking my phone, because I already knew it would be silent, not because she was worried, but because she was not. And that silence confirmed everything I needed to know. And I got back in the car and kept driving until the sky began to lighten just enough to hint at morning, until the city skyline behind me disappeared completely, replaced by open roads and unfamiliar exits. And it was somewhere out there, between nowhere and somewhere new, that I made the second decision, the one that mattered more than leaving. I decided I was not coming back, not in the way she understood me, not as the man who stood quietly in the background, not as the version of Ethan Cole who tolerated being overlooked, because disappearing is not just about leaving a place. It is about removing access, removing expectations, removing the identity people have grown comfortable diminishing. And by the time the sun rose, casting that pale orange light across the horizon, I had already started letting go of the things that tied me to that life, the routines, the habits, the version of myself that waited to be acknowledged. And instead of turning toward anything familiar, I took the next exit without checking the sign, because for the first time, not knowing where I was going felt better than staying exactly where I had been. By mid-morning, I found myself in a small town I could not name without checking a map, the kind of place where the gas station still had handwritten signs taped to the windows and the coffee came in thick ceramic mugs instead of paper cups. And I pulled into a roadside diner more out of instinct than hunger, sliding into a booth by the window as sunlight spilled across the table in long quiet lines. And for a moment I just sat there, hands folded, listening to the low hum of conversations that had nothing to do with me, people talking about weather, work shifts, weekend plans, ordinary lives that did not feel like they were collapsing under the weight of unspoken things. And it struck me how long it had been since I felt this kind of stillness, not the tense silence of a strained marriage, but the kind that simply exists without asking anything from you. And when the waitress came by with a tired smile and asked what I wanted, I realized I had not made a simple decision for myself in a long time, not without considering someone else first. And I ordered eggs, toast, and more coffee than I needed just to feel the act of choosing something that belonged entirely to me. And while I waited, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone for the first time since the night before, the screen lighting up with a handful of notifications that looked smaller than I expected, less urgent, less important, and there were no missed calls from her, no messages asking where I was, just a couple of automated emails and a weather alert I had ignored. And I stared at that empty space where her name should have been and felt something settle deeper inside me, not anger, not even disappointment, just confirmation, the kind that removes any last illusion you might still be holding on to. And I turned the phone face down on the table without unlocking it, because whatever connection existed there no longer held any weight. And when the food arrived, I ate slowly, not because I was savoring it, but because I was letting time stretch, letting this new reality take shape without rushing to define it. And somewhere between the second cup of coffee and the last bite of toast, I started to think about what came next, not in terms of revenge or proving anything to anyone, but in terms of rebuilding something that had been left unfinished for far too long. And I realized that disappearing had created a kind of space I had never allowed myself before, a clean break where expectations no longer dictated my choices. And for the first time I began to see that this was not an escape. It was an opportunity, a reset that most people never take because it requires letting go of everything familiar. And when I finally stood up, leaving cash on the table and stepping back out into the bright late morning light, I did not feel like a man running away. I felt like someone stepping into a life that had been waiting, quiet and patient, for him to finally show up. The first real change did not come from a big decision. It came from a small one, the kind that would not mean anything to anyone else but felt significant to me. I checked into a modest extended stay motel on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just clean sheets, a desk by the window, and a door that locked with a quiet click that sounded more final than I expected. And I placed my keys on the table and stood there for a moment, looking around at a space that held no history, no expectations, no version of me attached to it, and it felt unfamiliar in a way that was not uncomfortable, just honest, because for the first time in years, there was nothing in the room telling me who I was supposed to be. And I sat down on the edge of the bed and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, letting the silence settle again. And that was when the question finally came, not loud, not demanding, just steady and unavoidable. Who am I without all of that, without the routines, without the role I had been playing for so long that I stopped questioning it, and instead of pushing the thought away like I would have before, I let it stay, I let it expand, because avoiding it was what kept me stuck in the first place. And I realized that disappearing had not erased me, it had stripped away everything that was not actually mine, everything that had been shaped by someone else's expectations, and what was left was not empty, it was undefined, and that difference mattered more than I understood. At first, because undefined means there is room to build, to choose, to create something intentional instead of inherited, and I reached for my phone again, this time not to check for messages but to open my notes, a blank screen staring back at me like the start of something, and I typed a single sentence, simple and direct, what does the next version of my life look like? And I did not rush to answer it, I just sat there, letting ideas come slowly, not driven by urgency but by clarity, and for the first time I was not thinking about what I needed to prove, I was thinking about what I wanted to become, and that shift felt subtle but powerful, like adjusting the direction of a compass by a few degrees and knowing it would lead somewhere completely different over time. And outside the window I could see the late afternoon light beginning to soften, cars passing by on the road without noticing me, without needing to, and I understood that this was the beginning, not of Something dramatic or immediate, but of something controlled, something deliberate, because disappearing was not the end of my story. It was the moment I stopped being defined by someone else's version of it and started writing my own. The next morning did not feel like a fresh start. It felt like a continuation of something I had already set in motion, quiet, steady, and irreversible. And I woke up before the alarm I had not even set. The early light slipping through the thin motel curtains, painting the room in that pale, neutral color that makes everything look simpler than it is. And for a few seconds I just lay there, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside, letting the stillness settle before the day began. And I noticed something immediately. There was no weight on my chest, no pressure to check messages, no need to anticipate someone else's mood or expectations, just a clean mental space that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And I sat up, ran a hand through my hair, and reached for the notebook I had picked up the night before at a small convenience store. Flipping it open to the page where I had written that single question, what does the next version of my life look like? And this time I did not hesitate. I started writing, not in perfect sentences, not in a polished plan, but in fragments, ideas, pieces of something forming, words like control, independence, discipline, ownership, things I had not prioritized in years because I had been too focused on maintaining something that was quietly breaking. And as I wrote, I realized that this was not about proving anyone wrong, not about making a statement or creating a dramatic comeback. It was about building something that did not rely on anyone else's approval to exist, and that clarity changed the way I approached everything that followed, because instead of reacting, I started choosing deliberately, and the first choice was simple. I needed structure, something to anchor this new direction, so I got dressed, stepped outside into the cool morning air, and found a small gym a few blocks down, the kind with worn equipment and a front desk that did not ask too many questions, and I signed up without overthinking it, not because I needed to transform overnight, but because I needed consistency, a place to show up, a routine that belonged entirely to me. And as I moved through the first workout, nothing extreme, just steady, controlled effort, I felt something shift, not physically, not yet, but mentally, like I was reclaiming pieces of myself that had been dormant. And it was not about intensity, it was about intention, about proving to myself that I could follow through on something without distraction, without compromise. And when I left, sweat cooling against my skin. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, I did not feel like a different person. I felt like the same person who had finally decided to change direction, and that distinction mattered because transformation is not a single moment. It is a series of choices made consistently over time. And as I walked back toward the motel, passing people who had their own routines, their own lives unfolding without interruption, I understood that what I was building would not be visible right away. There would be no immediate recognition, no instant validation, just quiet progress, and for the first time that was enough because I was no longer interested in being seen the way I used to be. I was focused on becoming someone who did not need to be overlooked in order to realize his own value. By the end of the first week, the routine started to feel less like something I was forcing and more like something I was stepping into naturally. Waking up at the same time each morning, training, writing, thinking, not in a frantic way but in a controlled rhythm that gave the day a shape I had been missing for years. And what surprised me was not how difficult it was, but how simple it felt once I stopped negotiating with myself, once I removed the constant background noise of trying to maintain a version of life that was never fully mine, and I began to notice details I had ignored before, the way my mind stayed clearer throughout the day, the way decisions came faster without second guessing, the way silence no longer felt heavy but productive, and somewhere in that quiet structure, I started to revisit parts of my past I had left untouched, not out of pain, but out of neglect, skills I had developed years ago and then set aside because they did not fit into the life I had been maintaining, ideas I had once considered but never pursued because they did not seem practical at the time, and I pulled those threads back into focus, sitting at the small desk in the motel room each evening, sketching out possibilities, mapping out what I could build if I committed to it fully, not for recognition, not for validation, but for ownership. And that word kept coming back to me, ownership not just of work or income, but of time, of direction, of identity. And I realized that for a long time I had been outsourcing those things without realizing it, allowing circumstances, relationships, and expectations to define the boundaries of my life. And now that those boundaries were gone, there was no excuse to stay the same, and that realization carried a certain weight, not pressure but responsibility, because starting over is not just freedom, it is also accountability. There is no one else to blame, no one else to adjust around. Every outcome becomes a direct reflection of the choices you make, and instead of avoiding that, I leaned into it because it felt honest. And one afternoon, while reviewing old contacts and notes I had not opened in years, I came across an opportunity one had once dismissed, a business connection that had not made sense at the time but now fit perfectly into the direction I was building. And I stared at the information for a moment, feeling that familiar hesitation rise, the instinct to delay, to overthink, to wait for the perfect moment. And then I did. Something different. I acted. I reached out, not with desperation, not with uncertainty, but with clarity, presenting who I was and what I intended to build without explaining my past, without justifying the gap, because none of that defined what I was capable of now. And after I sent the message, I did not sit there refreshing the screen or wondering how it would be received. I closed the laptop and stepped outside, letting the late afternoon air hit my face, understanding that progress is not about immediate results. It is about consistent movement, and whether that opportunity responded or not, the fact that I had taken action without hesitation marked a shift that mattered more than any single outcome, because it meant I was no longer waiting for permission to move forward. I was already doing it. The reply did not come immediately, and that was exactly what I expected, because anything worth building rarely responds on demand, and for the first time I did not interpret the silence as rejection or doubt. I saw it for what it was, neutral, just time passing, and I continued with the routine I had started, each day stacking quietly on top of the last, workouts becoming more structured, thoughts becoming more precise, and the ideas I had written down beginning to take clearer form, not just concepts anymore but actual plans, timelines, numbers, something tangible that I could move toward instead of just thinking about. And what I began to notice was that the more I focused on building forward, the less I thought about what I had left behind, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer required my attention, and that shift created a kind of mental space that allowed me to operate without distraction. And then, 3 days later, the message came, short, direct, no unnecessary words, an invitation to talk, and I read it once, then set the phone down without reacting immediately, not out of hesitation but out of control, because I no longer needed to respond from a place of urgency. I could choose the moment, the tone, the position I wanted to present, and that alone was a change from who I had been before. And when I finally replied, it was simple, confirming a time, nothing more, no explanation, no attempt to impress, just clarity, and the meeting was set for the following afternoon at a small office space about 20 minutes from where I was staying. And when the time came, I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I respected the opportunity, and I walked into the building with a steady pace, noticing the details automatically, the clean floors, the quiet professionalism, the kind of environment where decisions were made without noise. And when I sat across from him, I did not feel like I needed to prove myself. I felt prepared, because everything I had been doing over the past days was not just about rebuilding discipline. It was about aligning myself with a direction that made sense. And as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that this was not a random chance. It was a door that had been there all along, one I had simply been too distracted to walk through before, and I spoke with precision, not overselling, not underselling, just stating what I could do and how I intended to do it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the difference between being heard and being acknowledged, not politely but seriously. And when the meeting ended, there was no immediate outcome, no handshake that sealed everything, just a mutual understanding that something had started. And as I stepped back outside into the late afternoon light, I did not feel the need to analyze every word or replay the conversation in my head. I simply recognized that I had moved forward, and that movement, steady and intentional, was already changing the trajectory of everything that would come next. The days that followed did not explode into success or dramatic change. They settled into something quieter, more precise, like a machine beginning to run smoothly after being calibrated correctly. And I leaned into that rhythm without trying to rush it, because I understood now that momentum is built through consistency, not intensity. And each morning I followed the same pattern, waking up early, training, reviewing notes, refining ideas, and then extending those ideas into action, small steps that did not look impressive from the outside but were stacking into something solid beneath the surface. And the opportunity from the meeting did not remain abstract for long. It evolved into conversations, then into outlines, then into actual work, and I found myself stepping into a role that felt both familiar and completely new at the same time. Familiar because it drew on skills I had developed years ago. New because this time I was operating without hesitation, without deferring, without waiting for validation before moving forward. And what stood out most was how differently I handled pressure. There were moments where timelines tightened, where decisions needed to be made quickly, where the old version of me might have paused, overanalyzed, or second-guessed. But now the response was immediate, controlled, deliberate, not reckless, not rushed, just decisive, and that difference changed the way others interacted with me as well. because people respond to certainty in a way they do not respond to doubt. And as the work progressed, I could feel that shift. Conversations became more direct, expectations became clearer, and the respect that comes from consistent execution began to take shape. Not announced, not declared, just understood, and outside of the work itself, I continued to build the structure around it, refining my routine, tightening my schedule, eliminating anything that did not contribute to the direction I had chosen. And it was not about isolation, it was about focus, about protecting the clarity I had worked to establish. And one evening, sitting at the same desk in that quiet motel room, reviewing the progress I had made in what felt like a short amount of time but was actually the result of disciplined repetition, I noticed something that caught me off guard. I was no longer thinking about being overlooked. I was no longer measuring myself against what had happened before, because the version of me that had been standing in that room weeks ago, holding a glass and absorbing words that reduced his presence to something unwanted, no longer felt like who I was now. And that realization did not come with anger or resentment. It came with distance, a clean separation between who I had been and who I was becoming. And as I leaned back in the chair, looking out at the dim lights of the parking lot, I understood that the disappearance had worked exactly as it needed to, not because anyone noticed, but because it allowed me to rebuild without interference, without expectation, and without the weight of being defined by someone else's perception. And for the first time, that felt like real progress, the kind that does not need to be announced to be undeniable. It was not a single moment that confirmed everything had changed. It was a pattern, a series of small outcomes that began to align in a way they never had before. And about 3 weeks into this new rhythm, the work I had stepped into started producing results that were no longer just internal, they were visible, measurable, something that existed outside of my own perception. And the first time I saw the numbers come back stronger than expected, I did not react the way I might have in the past. There was no rush of excitement, no need to share it with anyone, just a quiet acknowledgement that the process was working. And that calm response told me more about my progress than the result itself, because it meant I was no longer driven by external validation. I was anchored in execution, and as the days continued, those results began to compound. Conversations that once felt like opportunities started to become partnerships. Ideas that once needed explanation were now being understood immediately, and the pace of everything increased without feeling chaotic, because it was built on structure, not impulse. And somewhere in the middle of all that movement, something unexpected happened. Not dramatic, not disruptive, just a small notification that appeared on my phone one afternoon while I was reviewing a set of documents, a name I had not seen in weeks, Laura, and I stared at it for a second longer than necessary. Not because it pulled me back, but because it felt distant, like seeing a place you used to live in after you have already moved on. And the message itself was simple, a question, where are you? And what struck me was not the words, but the timing, because for the first time, the question did not carry urgency, it did not create pressure, it just existed, and I let it sit there without opening it immediately, finishing what I was working on before even considering a response. And when I finally read it, I realized there was nothing in it that required an answer, not because I was avoiding it, but because it no longer aligned with the direction I was moving in, and that clarity made the decision easy. I did not reply, not out of anger, not as a statement, but because engagement would have pulled me back into a version of myself I had already left behind, and I set the phone down, returning my focus to the work in front of me without hesitation. And that moment, small as it seemed, marked something significant. It was the point where the past no longer had any control over my present. Not emotionally, not mentally, not even out of habit. And as the afternoon light shifted across the desk, casting longer shadows across the pages I was reviewing, I understood that this was the real transformation, not the external success, not the progress others might eventually notice, but the internal shift where my attention, my decisions, and my direction were no longer influenced by what I had left behind. And from that point forward, everything I built would come from that place, steady, intentional, and entirely my own.